First of all, let me apologize that we'll keep you away from your lunch. But I think we'll keep this talk very interesting, so it will open up your appetite more. My name is Feđa Kulenović. I've come from the University of Sarajevo, from the chair of information science at the Faculty of Philosophy. And today, as you can see on your agenda, the topic is digital rights and digital frights. We will try to keep the frights away as much as we can, but we have to talk about them. And with me, not in a particular order, but in the order of this list, is first of all Gillian York from the EFF, or the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Then Alicja Peszkowska, is it? I always mispronounce your name, from the Responsible Data Community, and so many others, the engine room as well. Then we have Diego Naranjo, Naranjo, okay, from the European Digital Rights, and Domen Savic, also known as Citizen D, and finally Edina Harbina from the Aston University in Birmingham. Welcome, everybody. I'm really pleased that I get to moderate such a great panel of people and digital rights activists in all shapes and forms and sense. Since this is a point 10, I was thinking that I'll open up the floor for you to, first of all, discuss how did we get here. So what was the, let's say, digital rights 1.0, and how did we get to the digital rights 2.0, and where are we now? So we have some kind of historical perspective of these fights and frights for the digital rights. So whoever wants to start, I guess, Gillian, you can.
All right, sure. And that was a great rhyme there, frights and rights. Yeah, okay. Anyway, I lost it already. So yeah, I mean, I'll just talk briefly about where I came into this space, which was in 2007-8. And I think just looking at the progression from then to now, I think what we've seen is a progression where there was agreement, as I think my fellow panelists will talk about, agreement on a large number of issues, but also sort of a lack of cohesive understanding about the ways in which the internet was regulated, who runs the internet, how websites are blocked, all of that. And so that early period of kind of the emergence of the digital rights space, let's say, because there were things that preceded it, of course, regulation in the United States and so forth. But the early emergence of the digital rights space, from my perspective, of course, there was movement in the 90s and a little bit after that, but I think really solidified around the late aughts. And then, of course, we go into the period of time which we're going to hear a lot about tomorrow, the kind of revolutionary period around 2011, and I think we'll hear a bit as well on this panel, but where we saw debates happen around the role of social media, the early debates, where we often would see those, or at least the majority kind of saw those as platforms that were, in favor of the things that we're in favor of freedom, in favor of revolution, expression, etc. But also the emergence of the copyright debates that we saw a little bit later on. And so for me, just to kind of close my point, for me, I see the turning point, and I'm going to sort of pause it with this. I see the turning point for all of this somewhere around 2014 to 2016, with a few things that I'll leave for the panelists to touch upon. One, I think, is the recognition and realization of these spaces as a place for harassment and all sorts of other social ills, so around Gamergate, things like that. Two is the political aspects of this, so the rise of populism and the right, the election of Donald Trump and populists, of course, throughout Europe and the rest of the world. And three, the role that violent extremism, has played in organizing online. And we saw this first, I think, not first, but most prominently with the rise of ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, and then later on, of course, with the rise of extremist white supremacist movements. And so where we are now, I think, is a very fragmented internet, a very fragmented digital rights scene, where our perspectives are not always shared. And so I'll leave it at that and pass on to the next person. I'm sure we'll come back to some of these issues.
Well, I guess Edina can continue from there, and then we'll...
Sure. Hi everyone. So as an academic, I guess the only academic on the panel, and coming from the United Kingdom and being from here, I'm in a sort of a weird position, but similar to Gillian, I've been in this space for now probably about 12, 13 years since my PhD and the work in digital regulation and digital rights. And not just purely academic work in this area, because I also sit on the advisory council of ORG, which is Open Rights Group, one of the largest digital rights organizations in the UK. So I sort of have an insight into the activist side of it as well. And I do a lot of work with the legislators at the moment with the UK Parliament. So just next week I'm going to testify in the Parliament at the committee around the online safety bill, which is one of the huge pieces of legislation that aims to regulate platforms similar to the Digital Services Act in the EU, but in a very different way, and we can come back to that. So I've jotted down in my notes just a few headlines from the past 10 years and where we were and where we got, and I'll try to be short, even though I'm an academic. I try to short and focus. So we moved, I would say we moved to what was predominantly at that time when I started, and to say 10-ish years ago, what was the discussion around copyright, infrastructure, regulation, regulatory factors and stakeholders, and the net neutrality, into what Gillian has said, more fragmented discussion. And we wanted to use a less popular word that I'm not going to use, the B word. So you can guess which word is this. Yeah, Feja would have banned me if I use this word, free speech. But so we now have regulation everywhere. And it affects digital rights in very different forms and different ways. So at the moment, on the table in the EU and the UK, there are major law reforms proposals that aim to tackle platforms, harm in different forms, in different ways, and as a result impact predominantly freedom of expression, but of course also other digital rights such as the right to privacy and data protection. So I think with all these proposals on the table, it's difficult for activists and the community and academics to follow everything in depth. So we're trying just to, cover as much as we can of what is going on, and it's increasingly difficult. So I think, very blunt conclusion, and I presume most of you will agree, is that the internet freedoms have been steadily declining. And this is evidenced, for example, in the Freedom of the Net report from Freedom House, and I'll be authoring the UK's report for this year. And I can't tell you what the score will be, but it's not optimistic because of the law reforms that are ongoing in the UK. And these scores have been steadily decreasing in the US, for example, and elsewhere in the world. So we are not in a good position in terms of the internet freedoms, I would say, in the rise of censorship. And that's further complicated with new forms of technology in the recent years, what we didn't have that much 10 years ago, such as AI, machine learning, blockchain, and etc. So I'll stop here and I'll let other panelists, and we can come back to some of these points later. Thank you.
Okay, so considering we've started kind of with a broad overview of a pretty much top-bottom approach, I'll let Diego continue with that, and then we'll switch over to the community side. That is very important.
Yeah, thank you. And also not only to continue on a top-down sort of approach and sort of a broader spectrum, a broader view, but also I wanted to bring back a bit of optimism. I think they say that optimism is a revolutionary act, so I think it's good to be, for those of us who work on civil society, we're constantly losing battles. We win a few, so I like to stay optimistic. And I would say that actually in the last 10 years, I've been working on this profession in the last 7.5, 8 years. I would say that I actually see strength in the digital rights community. I've seen a lot of setbacks, of course, but also some big wins. I started working on digital rights right after the Snowden revelations, and that brought a lot of awareness of the need to protect privacy and data protection. Then we adopted data protection legislation in the EU, and also we reinforce privacy legislation. We ban certain forms of mass surveillance, such as data retention. We rejected upload filters to some extent in the copyright directive. But we did, of course, lose some fights. On the issue of the fragmentation, I think that what is happening, or that's my perception, rather that more fragmented, is more diverse. There are a lot more actors who are not digital rights groups who work on digital. And because I see that within EDRI we have 47 members, including 3 of you. And right now, I generally see quite a harmonized approach to anything we work on, from upload filters to freedom of expression, to platform regulation and net neutrality and so on. But I do that other actors, for example, a hate speech expert or anti-racist organization or sex workers organization, they might not always be on the same side that we are on some of the topics. So that there I do see a difference. And I think that's one of the struggles I see within EDRI, but also in the broader digital rights community, to include all of these people, all of these civil society groups, trade unions, feminist groups, migrants organizations, to talk about what impacts them from a technology. I think, again, within the digital rights committee, there's sort of quite some agreement on most of the points, but we need to see what they have to say, and perhaps say if perhaps we were wrong on some of the assumptions we have, or we need to correct ourselves. And just to finalize, a point that I've seen also a change in the last 10 years is the change from the individual perspective to the collective one. When I started in EDRI, it was a very much privacy nerd community focused on protecting your phone, encrypt your personal laptop, and do not use Google. And we've seen, thankfully, an evolution from that to working on collective rights, to work on economic, social, and cultural rights, to work on anti-racism. And I think that's a good thing. I think we're getting out of our own bubble that we created ourselves, and going back to the collective and doing collective efforts.
Thank you. So now we'll switch with the 2 of you that are very important, and I'll ask first of all Lita, because she's basically somewhere in between the community organization and also being part of different efforts to get as many people involved in digital rights. But as far as I could understand, from the standpoint of not how do we defend, but how do we sort of, I wouldn't say attack, but at least even the playing field between the big players in the field and us, the small people.
So I am a community builder, and I've been working with tech and social change. I kind of feel like, you know, I've grown up with this topic, like when it comes to my professional life. So I would say, I guess it started with a lot of tech optimism, and this idea that maybe everything is possible, and a lot of, to be very honest, a divide between it's possible if we take it like away from those holding power, which I would say was very teenagey, if you want to use this metaphor. And I felt like in the course of my work, it went a lot from access and transparency towards more responsibility and accountability, and you know how nuanced it is to have access to technology, and how nuanced technology is as a thing, and how not separate it is from anything else. So I worked a lot with open data and digital commons, and now I work a bit more with safety and protection and digital consent and all of the other issues that communities of social justice organizations and climate justice organizations are bringing up. Maybe like on this note, like going from techno-optimism to being a bit more skeptical, maybe reasonable, maybe matured. In this debate, I have to say I'm a bit concerned about the entire Web 3.0 situation. And, you know, when it comes to communities, the idea of DAO communities and how it can save us. I think by now maybe we should know that systemic change is needed, and like by systemic change I mean not only legislation, which is very important, but the legislation has to be backed up, informed, and then backed up by the reality of social actors. so maybe in my work, I work a bit more with like bringing people together so that they can make these points or realize those points, like, and then implement them in different ways. Yeah, maybe I will stop here actually.
Domin, you have a very, let's say, a broad overview, but also a very specific activist work that you do in Slovenia, which is part of this region, and we sometimes look up to you for good things, but also sometimes for the bad things. So give us an overview of how basically your experience with particularly also media relations, which I think you probably had a lot of experience in that sense, has brought us to some of the points that previous members of the panel said.
So I have to decide which hat to wear. So if I'm gonna be a journalist or an activist, you just labeled me as an activist. So fine. I think in the last 10 years, regionally but also globally, I have to say, we saw, I think it's two things. We're not going to say the B word. We're going to say the fragmentization of the issues connected with digital rights. But also we've seen the old model of technology distribution and technology permeating every or almost every social, let's say, sphere of our society, thus causing problems and in smaller scale solutions, right? So internet 10 years ago was still something that was so to say out of a can or being used by a smaller group of people for rather specific goals. So the whole development of the internet scene was sort of in a way elitist. And moving forward, we saw that the internet is basically what is running the world now, right? And with new interest groups entering the fray, with new discussions being had around concepts that are not just technological but also sociological. In my opinion, we saw that we still keep doing the same mistakes that were done with every electronic, so to say, technology or electronic media spanning back to radio and television, right? So you had the first issue of popularization, where everybody had to have their own radio set or phone set or TV set. And then you had an issue of content regulation, of access, of distribution channels, of political frameworking the technology. And I think that that's what we're doing now. And to sort of riff off Diego's optimism, pessimism, usually I'm a pessimist regarding these issues, because being in the center or close to the center, I'm rather impatient in terms of how long do these things take. But I guess I could say, and I'll stop here, I guess I can say that we're very poorly learning from our mistakes and moving forward.
Okay, so I'll continue with you. So we kind of do the circle back, and you raised some points that are interesting in terms of looking into the past, even before this digital and now I would say post-digital era, where we basically live with the internet and not by side the internet. So you can put your other hat on and see how basically there's always an issue of this frights, which we really raise a lot with the as Alicia said, teenagey stuff or juvenile stuff. So we're always concerned about the well-being of kids and so on, and that's been in the focus of digital rights for a long time, in the sense of social media, how can they access it and so on. And we're having this again, the same discussion, how the media has a bad effect on the young ones. So well, I don't know about the radio, but in the 60s it was about the TV and how it is, TV is a bad influence. Then the Walkman generation, no one's listening to anyone, with the 1984 commercial by Apple. So in that sense, and now we're reaching where we're saying, again, the social media is to be blamed for any social issue that we actually haven't learned since the dawn of the ages. And how do we actually, as journalists, as activists, or whichever hat you want to wear, address this issue and move away from the fear that we do have and concerns for mostly, okay, teenagers, but also everyone else, in a sense, including the ones that, you know, the men who have been holding the power for so long, and moving towards this dialogue that everyone's mentioning that exists, but it's not like it's fragmented, the positive F word, and it, like, how do we actually use the technology to unify all these approaches and make some kind of joint effort to move away from being afraid of the technology and regulating technology to actually coexist with it and use it for something better, or learn from our mistakes?
I think we have to talk about dividing the roles or dividing the responsibilities based on our roles, right? So coming from let's say, even coming from either a media or an activistic side, I'm often faced with this huge perception of responsibility, especially working from a place like Slovenia, which is a very small country, and, you know, you can relatively quickly select or highlight all of the people involved in decision-making process in policy development. And one of the things that's really dangerous, even on a global level, is that activists are being perceived as a systemic part of solution-building systems in these regards, privacy, security, digital rights, and so on. And I've always struggled with this idea, because if you say, or if you perceive these organized groups that have limited access, limited power, limited knowledge even, and maybe even very specific goals, if you give them this, even just a perception, if you give them this perception of a systemic function, and you equate them with the government, the parliament, the regulatory bodies, the other systemic bodies, I think you're making a mistake where you're putting somebody who doesn't know how to drive really into the driving seat, right? And then if the activists fail, if the activists miss something, then the problem becomes even greater, because nobody from, let's say, the outside pays attention to it, because the society says, okay, the activists are taking care of this. Same with journalists, right? So journalists, fourth estate, watchdog, they have a function that is, I think, greater than the function of activists in a civic society. But at the same time, they're very limited in their scope, in their knowledge, in their perception. And they are often, again, their role is misinterpreted in terms of what should they be doing, or how should they be protecting us from, let's say, the government, which is always a funny thing. Living in a democracy, you elect your political representatives, and then you have to have private companies, media companies, which are private most of the times, to guard you from basically your democratically elected people. Fun thought. But anyway, so how do we connect, or how do we role play these two groups? I think on the case of journalism, I think journalists should move, if they didn't already, from this techno-deterministic reporting on technology and services in terms of, oh, look at the flashy gadgets, look at the flashy services. And activists should actually focus more on engaging in a long-term decision-making process, sort of like EDRI and other groups, and should maybe shy away just a little bit from these one-time campaigns that are focusing on, oh, we're going to teach everybody how to use Signal, we're going to teach everybody how to use I don't know what, because by, you know, removing the decision and the policy development part of the solution, I think you're actually doing more harm than good, because, you know, if anybody is not cool or does not know how to use Signal, or doesn't know how to use like other privacy tools, then they're putting themselves in danger, and they're putting in danger everybody who's been in contact with them, right? And what's the right way to do it? By policy development, by creating legal frameworks that are then enacted in public or in the real world efficiently, so that everybody's protected, right? And everybody's covered by the same rules and understandings that are then executed by representatives, governments, and so on.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is that, again, we're doing the same thing. We're giving the private companies, like, okay, if you, or whatever, organizations, a signal, like, okay, let's use Signal, not use this, and it's not the right approach, but let's do the...
Because, just like a footnote, because you have to have even more, so by using Signal, people are usually said, or Signal is usually sold by a concept of, oh, just use Signal, it's okay, right? That's like the worst thing you can say to a person, because things change, right? If you just see like the thing with DuckDuckGo, right? So this was a browser that was for years recommended highly by privacy actors, by activists as the browser because they protect your privacy. It turned out like literally 3 or 4 weeks ago that they were selling off their data to so it's actually, if you want to go that way, sure, but that is, it takes a lot of energy, a lot of focus, and a lot of other things that people don't have. Instead, you know, focusing on the policy issues, focusing on actual effective regulatory models, I think that's the way to go, because it frees all of our times to do hopefully something more interesting.
Okay, so Alicia, I'll just move on to, because you mentioned community builder and so on, and so the communities are important. So it's not only one or like a media community or activist community, but generally the people. And you mentioned environmental action, which is really important. So how do you actually connect these two communities that usually, like, environmentalists haven't been so big on technology before? They used it to promote some of the work. But how do you kind of connect them and make a step forward to something that is actually moving away from these fragmented elements of giving responsibility to someone that shouldn't actually, just changing the shift from government to activist?
So this is a very complex question, and I also made a couple of notes because like, we keep using the word fragmented, and I would like to think about it more as nuanced. And I do not think that's going to be a very blanket statement, but I don't think there is much space in our world to hold space for ambivalence and nuance. And this is how we should think about big issues, and they're usually also social issues, and they are reflected and amplified by technologies. And like, to just make a couple of those points, it's you know, if we talk about the civil society, we have activists, but we have organizations. Organizations usually have their theories of change, and the policy making is a part of it. But we know the reality in which, the capitalistic reality, we kind of almost all operate within, and you know, organizations don't have that much, I mean, they are torn between working with people on the ground and like responding to very acute needs, and potentially informing very big decisions. They don't always have the space to do it completely right, and that's the reality of working or helping, supporting capacity building for social justice organizations. They have to balance things, and you know, the more agency they're being given when it comes to technology, and it happens a bit more organically, not just through legislation, the more responsibility they also hold for those they can potentially harm also by the use of technology. So I just feel there is, yes, a lot of ambivalence and nuance in this space, and everything is connected, and that's the truth also for the climate justice movement, because there is you know, the issue of tech being sustainable and green, and what does it mean, and climate-related misinformation, which is also big. And when it comes to the misinformation, I feel like we are also very often trying to solve this issue from the, like, solving not the root of the issue, but you know, just like editing and content moderation, instead of also maybe looking at why there is so much need for people to create their own information bubbles and self-affirming communities, you know, what is maybe being not seen on a very fundamental level that is being reflected by what's happening, and how like we should try to solve it by some cross-disciplinary, you know, actions. Threats to safety and migration justice is also a big one when it comes to climate and technology. So I don't know. It's just all very, and when it comes to migration and technology, there is all of the problems coming with, you know, people building tech systems to help vulnerable communities that cannot consent to this data being processed and then being harmed in many ways we cannot sometimes even imagine. So yeah, like social organizations have to also look a bit into the future, and there is just so much like, it's like a balancing act. So I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question. I'm just like trying to reflect on how complicated of an issue it is.
Yeah, and I guess it all reflects the complexity of organizing communities, because we cannot, I wouldn't talk ever about one community because it's different voices in different communities. And I guess you are you've answered the question by saying it's very nuanced, and it's also not only communities of people, but organizations and so on. So Jillian, I guess the US perspective is a bit different to some extent, but it's also similar. And I won't ask you a concrete question because I'm sure you have a lot of follow-up to do to these two questions. So I'll just let you, basically be yourself.
Sure. I mean, as you know, I don't do much work in the U.S., but I do work for I work for the EFF, which is a large U.S.-based organization. I'm on the international side of things. But to just kind of bring those threads together, I think what I can say is that, because there's so much I want to respond to, so I'm going to try to do it all at once. Thinking about inclusion and community, I think that that's one of the most positive things that we've seen over the past few years. In the U.S., I can speak to this, that so I think people are familiar with intermediary liability protections that we have there, CDA 230 or Section 230. It saw one of the biggest threats to it a few years ago with the passing of what's called SESTA FOSTA, which was a bill that was meant to protect people from sex trafficking, but which has had a massive impact on all sorts of nudity, sexual content, sex workers, etc. And the mobilization, even though it passed, and it was unfortunately not successful mobilization, although it's still ongoing, the mobilization that came from that was one of the first times that we'd really seen cohesive action between the digital rights community and sex workers. Similarly, as Diego mentioned, we've seen similar collaboration between LGBTQ communities and the digital rights community. And so for me, that's really one of the most positive developments over the past few years. I lost my notes, one moment. I think also to the point that Domin mentioned that, activists are always putting out fires. And when we were chatting outside before the panel, Alicia mentioned something about, there's a lot of solutionism going on. I think you just said it now too. Misinformation is one of the areas where we've seen a lot of why can't the companies just fix it? It's easy. Journalists fall prey to this as well. But just like, DAOs are not going to solve everything, there isn't one single solution. And I think that we have to make sure that we're prone to systems thinking. We have to not say just use Signal, use Tor. We have to look at the underlying issues in digital rights, the threat models, all of that with digital security. But we also have to look at the societal issues. Everything is a digital rights issue, but also this is going to be confusing, but also not everything is a digital rights issue. Misinformation, why does it happen? It doesn't happen because of Facebook. Facebook enables it, but it happens because we have all sorts of things going wrong in our societies. I would point to capitalism, but not everybody would. But nevertheless, I think that the really important takeaway for me here is that we do have to strengthen the communities. We have to strengthen North-South partnerships. We have to strengthen the communities the links between digital rights and other groups, climate activists, et cetera, et cetera. And I think also, just to touch on, since I know we don't have much time, the pandemic, we have seen a weakening of a lot of our communities because of the pandemic, whether it's because people can't cross borders, and we still have people who can't leave their countries now easily, whether it's because content moderation systems at social media companies have broken down because of labor issues, and companies have still not replaced those workers who were sent home in a lot of countries, like in the Philippines. We've really seen kind of, I don't want to use fragmentation because you're right, it's a weakening of a lot of structures. And so right now, we're in a moment of relative freedom, at least in terms of our movement. And so I think that this is the moment to seize that power and look towards writing the future. Not to quote myself, but I will quote myself.
Okay, so Dina, coming from on the legal side, and it has been discussed for a long time that the computer code is becoming the code, in a sense. So, to simplify it, so I don't become an academic here as well. But how do we actually balance? Because I think also the point of digital rights and creation sometimes ignores the creation of code and the open source community and so on, and all these things that sort of have been new in a sense of content creation, because code is also content. But how do we balance this between the legal elements like law and so on that is kind of decided in the on the national or international level, and again creation of code as such that sometimes in terms of algorithm that was mentioned and machine learning becomes the law of the land in digital space?
Yeah, that's an easy question. I'll answer it in one sentence, Joe. So thanks. And yes, you refer to Lawrence Lessig Code as law and the theory around regulation that has evolved a lot since the regulation of it, but I won't bore you with the regulation of the internet theory. What I would respond to this will be slightly more practical, I think. What we are seeing in the development of what I would say predominant code or mainstream code, if we talk about machine learning and AI, the code that covers most people rather than, pockets of free code that are somewhere and that the governments might not necessarily be interested in regulating. What the government wants to regulate since the inception of the law is the majority, isn't it? The most people, because you can't catch all, and no one wants to catch all, and you don't have the capacity as a government, you don't have enforcement capacity, and I'm simplifying this, but this is what's happening with the drive to regulate AI and machine learning and AI Act proposal in the EU and the UK strategy and the law that is coming up for EU, and that's of course for AI, and that's of course catching up as the law always is. So from that perspective, I don't think law can ever be balanced out with the code. The code will always drive regulation, if you wish, in this area. But to go back to some of the proposals or the optimism, and I'm not an optimist at all, I'm quite a skepticist. Sometimes even a defeatist, probably, and my niche area of research is digital death, so you can imagine, and I like music that talks about death a lot and could be a consequence of the Bosnian War as well, so just but what I can say, and I agree with all the words that we used, all the buzzwords, if you will, the fragmented, nuanced, complex, diverse, difficult, if you want, interconnected, because all of these different laws and regulations, if you talk about digital safety, you talk about AI, you talk about GDPR and data protection, you talk about human rights reforms that are ongoing now in the UK, you see interconnectedness between those, and all of those will affect digital rights in different forms. But they often don't talk to each other, not even within the same government department that is, for the UK, proposing the law. They don't, and it's not just the case for, the Balkans or the South or however you call it, but even the civil servants and the ministers don't talk to each other properly when they propose those. They just, I think for the UK is definitely true. They're populists who want to sell laws as something that their voters would like to see. Like, we are going to make the UK the safest place to be online in the world. We're going to save your children. And if you tell people, children, we're going to protect your health. We're going to protect you from the terrorists. no one can object. How can I? I can, of course, object to many of these arguments, but it's not very popular if you're a politician. So from that perspective, I'm very defeatist, and I think there are MPs in the UK and in the European Parliament to whom you can talk to as activists and perhaps try and work. And there are, of course, sensible people, but most of them aren't. And what I see in my research is that I think the most sensible part of the government branches is judiciary. In the UK, in the EU, definitely, like the CJEU, Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, and the example is the Brexit referendum and their decision. So I think that's where it's difficult, it's costly, but that's where we can help and work if we side with good lawyers, with academics as activists, and bring those cases like Schrems did, like Org did, Big Brother Watch, many other organizations. We can win some of these fights. And I would disagree with Domen in terms of education and media literacy, or maybe I didn't understand, but I think the investment that the digital community is making and the activists in education is essential in media literacy because the governments are not doing enough there. So the education part is very, very important, but also, of course, the other part that aims to influence the governments and the decision making and the policies. I'll stop because I could talk.
Okay, then after hearing how Adina listened to dark music that leads her to some sort of skepticism, I listen to ska music, I listen to funk, I like jazz a lot, and so I try to bring all this optimist music into my optimist point of view. But I mean, I'm not an idiot that thinks everything is right. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a job and we wouldn't be talking here. But I do think that generally progress, social progress, is like trying to move a big ship. You need a lot of people all the time trying to push, and you're going to move inch by inch, centimeter by centimeter, and you will not go very fast and very, very far away. That's what Domen was saying, that he's sometimes a bit impatient towards achieving progress, and I understand why, because he does, you guys do a lot of work, individual or in collectives, and we advance, but very little step by step. But I think we're still advancing, so that's my positive side. Then when I listened to Alicia and also to Domen before, made me think of, I had a perception that we might be giving the vision to some people that everything is so complicated, so nuanced. Do we work at the grassroots level, at the policymakers level? What do we do? And it makes me feel a bit anxious. Like when I read news about climate change, I just cannot read any more news about or more IPCC reports because I panic. But I think perhaps the most simple tip or advice you can give to people is, apart from you seeking and so on, is do something. Whatever you want to do. I mean, join your local trade union, join your whatever, save the bees in your city, save the climate, join a digital rights group. Whatever you want to do something, because again, we need more people to try to move this ship, this huge ship that it takes a lot of effort, a lot of time to just move 1 centimeter. So the more the merrier. So I guess everyone, I'm preaching to the choir here, everyone works for or is an activist. But I guess when we talk to people out there, I'd like to move them to do whatever they want, do any simple thing.
Okay, so like we've balanced out the good, the bad, and the ugly, in a sense. But I think we do have some optimism in that sense. And Edina mentioned media literacy, which is also a buzzword since a couple of years ago, at least in the region, which of course is important. But on the other side, what I've noticed, because I've been involved in some initiatives here, is that sometimes it's really hard to include these programs in high schools or primary schools, where you have a lot of voices actually misunderstanding what media literacy is. So there's also the educational community that's kind of more in a media culture area, and then new technologies come in and so on. So we all have these voices that are important, but what I've noticed is that it's really hard to unify them in a sense of finding the consensus, which is kind of a word that we use a lot in the region, especially in Bosnia. because we do everything by consensus. But I think it exists, as you said. But on the other side, I am concerned also with COVID that it's moving away in a sense, so that everyone has a different viewpoint on how COVID affected them, and of course it did differently affect different areas of the world. But for instance, the global south was probably more affected in that sense, or less to some extent, in terms of digital rights. So how do we move away from like, let's say, this present, and you did mention some of it, but that would be like, let's say, my final question. What are your thoughts in a sense of what is the direction forward? Dealing with social media companies, solving the issue of media literacy that is definitely needed for all levels of society, not only the young ones or in the school, because my concern is how do we actually include to use maybe also the passé term, digital immigrants, and how, because my observation is that the digital immigrants were driving the misinformation, or riding the misinformation wave more than us, who were, let's say, the natives. How do we solve this, and how do we start doing that today, whether as individuals or community or activists or whatever the hat we're wearing in any given moment of time. So let's start with you, Diego, and then we'll...
Quick round.
Okay, that's a very big question. I think rather than media literacy, what I'd like to see is more media ownership. The previous panel, people were talking about owning your devices or owning the tech and so on. So I think we need to own the media as well. And listening to Domen and thinking about journalism, I agree with everything he said. But I may think that it is a bit concerning that having sometimes, depending on the country, and the situation varies quite a bit, but it could be detrimental to having some private corporations, big media corporations, as the one at the forefront to protect us from politicians. In an ideal world of journalism, investigative journalism, that there's this sort of Indiana Jones type of journalist trying to find the truth, like we see in the film, that's right. But those Indiana Jones, well, I need to find a better analogy, but those investigative journalists that want to defend the truth, they have bosses and they have to pay their bills. So if those media are owned, but in most cases are in Europe, by big media conglomerates, the truth will be limited by the owner of that company. So I think I'd like to move forward to a place where people can own the media, can own the technology, they can own the places they work, and so there's a bit more democracy at work, which is a bit outside of what you asked. But I will leave it there because we have only 10 minutes.
You did answer the question, so to speak. Adina.
Okay, so I'll just bring in another buzzword for us here, which is user empowerment. Whatever that means, taking power from what and whom, and giving it to whom and how, in what form. But that's one of the buzzwords in the proposal that I mentioned, the digital service, the online safety bill, where there's one section in the whole 200 pages act that mentions user empowerment, meaning that you have the option to ignore anonymous posters or those who haven't verified their identity, and age verification is another massive area that I don't want to go into because it's very problematic from many sides. But user empowerment here for us, I guess, means media literacy, education, but education comes with problems of investments and who is deciding what is the curriculum, for whom. Is it the same people who are making those wrong decisions and want to take power from the companies because they are now, at least in the UK, politicians are angry at Facebook and Google because they've lost a lot of their own power. It's not because they want to protect the users. It's just a power game as anything else. So I think for us, it's important to connect. It's important to connect with the academics who do research in this area, and a lot of civil society organizations and activists actually do that. It's important to connect with profession, in this case, especially legal profession, because they know the routes towards justice, whatever justice is, again. And as for journalists, there are some amazing freelance journalists and great people that we can actually talk to, but we need to speak appropriate language, especially as academics. So it's the question of communication. But as Diego has mentioned, most of the media is owned by huge corporations and one man even. And they manage to lobby and protect their position. And in many acts that's happened, and that's what's happening in the UK. So just to present it to you shortly, content removal, they're protected from companies' duties, from platforms' duties to remove content if it's journalistic content. And journalistic content is defined as journalists belonging to registered news agencies. And this is a clear, direct result of huge media companies lobbying for exemption in the bill, where, for example, us as individuals and our content would be taken down because it's not journalistic, or it's not of democratic importance because it's not political. And what is political now? Is COVID content political? Is health and politics now overlaps, and many, many other areas? So in terms of free speech, this is essential. So I'll stop here. Connect, work together, and empower users, whatever that means. Jilly?
Sure. I'll keep mine really quick and practical. I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I'm sure I will agree over here as well. So first, I would say fight on multiple fronts. It's not just regulation. I know right now I think there's a lot of regulatory solutionism going on, but I think we have to remember that whatever happens in Europe is not necessarily going to be positive for the rest of the world or affect them. So fight on multiple fronts: the courts, legislation, fight directly with companies, educate the public, etc. My second one is, I think we lost a little bit of this during the pandemic. So this is a great time to go out and talk to journalists, policymakers, judges, the public, whatever, kids. And then my last one is around education specifically, which is meet people where they are. I think that, that speaks to the whole use signal, use Tor thing, that doesn't resonate with people. But I think it's also, if journalism isn't working for us right now, I mean, how many of us are doing activism on TikTok where the kids are? How many of us are writing songs about digital rights? I have. I'm sure some of you have as well. But why? Let's do more of that. Let's make it fun. Let's get the public involved.
So I'm going to say something very maybe universal or general, but the more I think about it, the more it seems to be at least somewhere towards the answer. So I think check your privilege, as an individual, but in whatever place you are at, in your business, in your organization, in your community, and hold the space for a meaningful conversation and participation, and then if you can, convey it, document it, translate it into something that can then be, used towards change. And then also, with this responsibility also come the limits. You need to know your limits, to not overpromise. Just, check your privilege and hold the space, because we need a lot more diverse voices and people from different backgrounds in this conversation, and they're not being heard.
So I guess I would say check your privilege and delegate give your privilege as well to others to empower the users, as Edina said. Domin.
Trying to think of a few sentences in the end. So I think that maybe first and foremost realize that tech is a political issue, and that it needs to be resolved through political decision-making processes. So if you are living in a democracy, or if you're living in a society that claims is democratic, then use democratic decision-making processes to sort of influence the development. That's number 1 and 2. Number 3 is that try and focus on I call it the boring part of saving the world, and actually seeing the process through from the beginning till the end, right? So I think that we haven't mentioned amazingly in this aspect, in this panel, is this society of spectacle, right? So we keep hearing these campaigns, these solutionism is part of the spectacle, but I think we have to follow through with some decision-making processes and see what they bring us in the end. So don't half-ass it, as the Americans say. And finally, I think it's important to realize that the regulatory models always came after the big crash, right? Titanic was the reason they started regulating airwaves. The Snowden revelation was the reason they started regulating data transfers, and we'll always play catch up with, let's say, the bad guys, but we can maybe preempt some things if we start taking the legal solutions and giving them some regulatory teeth or some regulatory clause, right? Because we've often seen this situation where regulation in itself didn't solve anything because the regulators and the citizens said, okay, we passed a law, everything will be okay now, it's the law and the law rules, and that's it. Thanks.
Okay, so I know everyone's hungry, so I guess we will open up the space for, well, we will check our privilege and delegate it to others and hear the questions from the audience before we actually start eating. Anyone has any?
Thank you. So, a fascinating conversation, so thank you very much. My question is around your intention. In Europe, I think you've had a lot of success in getting these big tech platforms to take some action. So do you have like the intention of regulating them, like going ahead and doing the regulation, or you just threaten them and then they do some action, like they self-regulate? Because it's very different elsewhere. Yeah, so I wonder what the approach is, if you have like a structured way of getting them to do certain things, or you have like the real intention of doing the regulation.
I'm not sure I understood the question, so I'm not sure I can reply. I'm sorry. No, I'm not sure I understood the question, so I'm not sure.
So how do we use the experiences of like what we, well, I haven't, but what other people have done in Europe or US or basically the global north of deploy, and how do we transfer these, like, what are the experiences of forcing tech companies to
Sorry, okay. Yeah, is that correct? Yeah. Yeah, so what's sort of the impact, and then what can we bring from that, our work, especially at the legislative making level, to other parts? So it's a bit of everything. It's a mixed bag of theoretical wins on the legislative front. Oh, we have the General Data Protection Regulation. That's great. I don't see Google or Facebook crying every night. I think they are perhaps stronger than ever. It's a good tool. Let's keep fighting. Let's bring it to court. Let's bring complaints. Today or yesterday, the Spanish Data Protection Agency fined Google with 10 million. So, okay, good. Score for us. But that said, I think as others said here, Alicia and others said in the end, also we need to go back to the grassroots level, and we will not solve everything with legislation, and also and we need to do activism, we need to do litigation, we need to do lots of things. So threatening and having good regulations helps, but it's not the only way to fix things.
Yeah.
Just to maybe add a point, looking into Europe from the outside, I mean, looking from Europe on the outside, I'm not sure that the EU is doing a wonderful bang-up job with solving these problems. I mean, it might compare to other regions, but generally speaking, I don't think Europe is... I mean, it's a sad day when Europe is like the pinnacle of effective solutions in this regard. And I think that we are still learning as we go, and that hopefully in some times we'll be able to really offer some type of situation where these issues are resolved. Currently, we're just putting out fires and hoping that we put them out faster than they start to flare up again. Yeah.
And if I just may add, I think it's, as you can imagine, about bargaining power and leverage that the EU has, and the market, and the money, of course, eventually. So the answer is quite pessimistic for smaller countries and the markets that are not very interesting for the corporations. What you can hope for is the Brussels effect, that some of these laws will force companies to change their systems and terms and conditions and roll it out to the rest of the world, hopefully. But as Domen has just said, and me following the evolution of GDPR since 2011 until its, from the consultation paper until its adoption, there has been a huge amount of lobbying, as for any other law, from the tech industry. So a lot of the provisions were changed and diluted. So it's not that the Europe has done something perfect. It was a result of it was compromise, and that compromise that we discussed over coffee before has created an uneven level playing field. So even less competition, because the big companies have the money to pay for lawyers, they can prepare, and then the smaller companies, the startups, they struggle with compliance. So we didn't really make a huge win. Of course, there are some wins that I recognize what Diego has said, but yeah.
What I've understood is basically the only example we can give is from the minority communities like the LGBTQ community, even feminist movement. How did they actually manage to force a very masculine organizations like Facebook and so on to talk to them, which is pretty much similar to how the global South is treated now by these big conglomerates?
Yeah, so this I can speak to. So back in like 2014, Facebook had their real names policy. I mean, they still do, but it was much more strict and people would get kicked off all the time, people of all different backgrounds. But what happened was that a number of drag performers in the San Francisco Bay Area, most of whom were white men, got kicked off of Facebook, and they organized along with digital rights organizations, the trans community, a bunch of different people, and protested outside of Facebook's headquarters and successfully pushed them to change that rule in a way that allowed for their identities. It's still not perfect, but nevertheless. Similarly, last year, a number of Palestinians were kicked off of Instagram for not even for protest action, but for recording protests and uploading them to Instagram. This caused, obviously, this is quite controversial, but a bunch of people from Palestine, from the broader Middle East and North Africa, as well as some international organizations, worked together to keep pushing Facebook until we got them on the phone. And that's an ongoing conversation in trying to shape those rules and the way that they're enforced. And I've seen similar things in other parts of the world as well. And so my point is that we have to fight on all fronts, while at the same time I think the Brussels effect is important. I think it's important for groups in other parts of the world to work with groups in Europe to make legislation that works for everyone. But I also think that a lot of the answers actually come from engaging the companies, and that's not always easy, but you can always, I think EFF is one organization, there's many more that are looking to try to make those connections stronger and help represent people who are not necessarily being heard by the major corporations.
Hi. My name is Aldo from Albania, and I wanted to make a comment and question in the end. Because I'm starting to get a little bit afraid, like I'm hearing this type of conversation, and every time they look like Matrix before Neo, like the secluded people there frightened and waiting for Neo, and we of course know that Neo is never coming in our real world. So, and I wanted also to speak up about the question you made about the feminism and how did they came out to push Facebook. On the other way, I think that I don't really want to talk to Facebook, or at least I don't want to talk only to Facebook. Like, I don't want to be inclined to be put in a position that where I, whoever I am, and whoever I represent, to go and to talk to Facebook, because like, who is Facebook at the end of the day? I see myself, and all of us, because I see myself as part of this, as translators, if you will, between policymakers and people. And these are generally the people that we are used to work with. So I see myself and the whole other colleagues of mine as literally as translators between the one and the other. Now, if we're talking about the digital rights, and if we talk at the same time that we have a massive digital literacy, I mean, heck, we have literacy spreading all around the globe and rising, so digital literacy is even more further away. What I would like to have in this fight, so that I don't go and pick up, every single criteria and law, I would like to have a manifesto. And this is the way how you go and translate it to people. This is at least how I hope I could, on one way, show to the people like what is going on, because what the manifesto is what it does. Like it creates simple idea, difficult ideas. It translates them to simple ideas on how to spread the idea towards the people, and then us as a translator to go and make a public pressure towards politicians, because at the end of the day, this is a political fact. This is a political decision, like the human rights. I mean, the same way that we fought for human rights towards the government, the same way I see this fight, this already here fight, because most of the people, they see this as a coming fight. This is already here, obviously. But I'm lacking, because obviously, on the other hand, it's impossible for all of us, even if we have the same platform and coordinated, it's impossible for us to go against Facebook or Facebook or Google, because they have so much money and people they can deploy it at any given moment that they can outnumber us at any given moment. But what I think is that also this, what we're doing, but I will also love to see like a sort of manifesto, like how can we synthesize all these ideas and make them more accessible for the people to understand what we're going through.
Okay, so first I want to say that NEO is an empty vehicle. So it's a lot around the techno-solutionism situation. So no, NEO is not coming and helping. But I don't know. I think, okay, something positive, something negative. So on the positive note, I think that civil society is progressing when it comes to coming up with policies for especially big international NGOs that are actually then used to build up for policy making on a more general level. So I think this is happening, and this is very positive. And that's just because we have a lot of social organizations that are more aware when it comes to technology. Then when you set human rights, I mean, some of the digital rights are maybe even all of them are human rights in a way. We're just kind of linking the two. But so I'm afraid we can't have one manifesto, because this is the neo narrative a bit. We have to have many different manifestos that are leveraged by different communities of stakeholders who can actually put those legislations in specific places. We have education, we have justice, we have climate. I mean, we have so many things. We cannot have one manifesto, unfortunately, for technology anymore. Yeah.
Anyone else wants to? Okay.
Yeah, so very quickly. For me, the only manifesto we need is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think with that we have enough, and the two covenants. So that's my manifesto. That's what it stands for, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the European Union. And then to follow up also on the analogy, I think we have lots of trinities and neos in the room, and non-binary characters and heroes. And so I think I'm again optimistic, and I think there's a lot of people litigating against Facebook, against Google, against governments. So again, going back to my eternal optimism, we need to keep up the fight and keep doing what we do.
Okay, I guess I'll just add one thing to answer your question, which is I think in terms of the big tech companies, which are mostly based in the US, the example of Somalian community that fought with Amazon as they were their workers is something that you could basically maybe use in a sense of the immigrant communities in the States can actually drive this change forward for the countries that they came from or they have some connection to. And I think that's the best way. The last question is from the audience online is basically, I guess, a bit of a complex question that I'll try to ask because I'm translating it, which is basically what do you expect from the oversight board when it comes to the Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans? And the second one is about Santa Clara principles and how they can help us.
Okay, cool. Facebook Oversight Board. So I'm going to be really just truthful here. Don't expect much, and you will be pleasantly surprised. So what I would say is that there's so many problems with the board, too many to talk about right now, a lot of structural issues, including the fact that when it launched, it was more than 25% Americans, which is completely unrepresentative of the user base. But anyway, that said, they've made some really interesting decisions and recommendations. The problem is Facebook doesn't care and has not implemented most of those things. So the board itself is not the problem, I will say. It's Facebook that's the problem. And so I don't think you can expect much, but it's still worth pushing these things to get, because the board recommendations and case decisions are made public, and so even though they're not necessarily going to be effective towards Facebook, it's still important to get those things published. So if you're coming from one of these countries, push the board to take on your cases, go to their open calls. The people on the board are actually quite great. So I will say that. The Santa Clara Principles, really quickly, the Santa Clara Principles on transparency and accountability and content moderation were a small set of principles, kind of a manifesto, that came out on the sidelines of a conference in 2018. It was just a group of people who happened to be at an event who wrote them. What we found was that a lot of companies were willing to endorse them. Reddit fully implemented them. So we said, okay, this is pretty cool. And they talk about just, you can look them up at santaclaraprinciples.org. I won't waste time there. But what we found was that some of our friends, especially in Global South countries, felt that they didn't go far enough. So what we did was we built a coalition of people from, I think, 13 or so countries to reach out to an even bigger group of people in 40 plus countries. We did an open submission process. This was a lot of work. I don't recommend doing things this way, but it was the pandemic, so what else were we going to do? We did an open call. We got submissions from everywhere, from Singapore to Kenya to Brazil and everywhere in between. And we painstakingly read through all of those submissions and wrote a new set of principles, 2.0, which are very, very long and detailed. But I think that they're pretty exceptional in terms of global collaboration. But also pretty exceptional in terms of a set of principles. They're less of a manifesto, they're much more of a set of principles. But right now what we're doing is actively trying to get companies to adopt them. We're in conversations with a lot of companies, but it's the smaller ones that are probably going to actually implement them. I don't see Facebook implementing them in their current, I just don't see positive change from the big companies right now.
Okay, so a bit of optimism, bit of skepticism.
Yeah, go to companies. I mean, if you want to help, if you want to get involved, you can reach out to me, but go to companies and talk to them about the principles.
Okay, so I guess we managed to finish on time. Are there any other questions? No. Then let me just do a quick announcement that we are reconvening at 3:30, as far as I was informed, so in 1 hour approximately, when we will continue to listen to other panelists who will have a lot to say and teach us, and I guess listen to us as well. Thank you. And thank you to my panelists.